It was a typical Sunday morning. The sun shone through the stained glass windows, casting colorful reflections across the pews. Inside the church, the congregation gathered, ready for what was meant to be a day of worship. Pastor Michael Anderson stood at the altar, ready to deliver his sermon to his flock. His wife, Sharon, sat in the front row, proud and supportive. Little did they know, today's service would take a shocking turn. In the back of the church, a woman sat with a cold, determined look. Alicia, the pastor's baby mama, had come to claim what was hers. She had no plans to let the day go by without confronting the pastor about the secret he had been keeping, a secret that would unravel everything. Alicia had been asking for a change, for more money, for more control. And Pastor Anderson, thinking he could manage the situation, had cut her off. But when a mother's demands aren't met, there's no telling what lengths she will go to. As the service progressed, the tension in the air thickened. Alicia couldn't wait any longer. She stood up, and in the silence of the church, every eye turned toward her. What happened next was unimaginable. How far can a mother go when the truth threatens to tear everything apart? What happens when the bond of family is crushed under the weight of lies, jealousy, and betrayal? Stay with us, as we reveal the shocking moment that shattered a family, a community, and a man's life, forever. Welcome to Inside True Crime Stories, where the shadows hold their secrets and every story is a mystery waiting to be uncovered. We're here to dive deep into the most chilling cases, unsolved crimes, and the dark side of the human experience that will leave you questioning everything. If you're ready to explore the twisted corners of the criminal world, you've come to the right place. A special thank you to our loyal viewers and subscribers. Your support means the world to us. It's because of you that we continue bringing these shocking stories to light, unraveling hidden truths, and sharing the mysteries that leave an impact on our lives. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and join our growing community. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions are what keep us going and help spread the word about these gripping cases. We're so grateful to have you with us on this journey. Let's get started. Pastor Michael Anderson was known in his Chicago community as a man of faith. His church was one of the most respected in the neighborhood, and his sermons touched the hearts of everyone who heard them. He preached about trust, loyalty, and the importance of family, values that gave him the reputation of a good, honorable man. But there was a side of Pastor Anderson that no one knew about. It was a secret he'd managed to keep hidden for years, tucked away behind the image of the caring, devoted pastor. Years earlier, during a time of weakness, he had gotten involved with a woman named Alicia. That affair led to the birth of a child, a daughter he never acknowledged publicly. Alicia, however, never let go of that connection. She demanded that Pastor Anderson pay a monthly allowance for their daughter's well-being. At first, the pastor felt guilt and responsibility, and so he sent the money, month after month. He did it in secret, thinking it would keep things quiet, thinking it would allow him to maintain the life he had built with his wife, Sharon. But as the years went by, Pastor Anderson began to feel the weight of the lie. He wanted to cut off the financial support, to put an end to the arrangement, and protect his family's reputation. Alicia, however, had other plans. She wouldn't let him walk away so easily. Tensions began to build, and what had once been a quiet arrangement turned into a dangerous game. On a bright Sunday morning, the church was buzzing with energy. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air as congregants filed in, eager to hear the message. Families sat together, chatting quietly, children running through the aisles. It was the usual calm before the storm, the kind of day that seemed like any other. But as Pastor Anderson stood at the pulpit, preparing to speak, a heavy weight hung in the air. The tension was unspoken, but it was there, between him and his wife, Sharon, sitting just a few rows in front of him. She had no idea what was about to unfold. Sharon, wearing a smile, exchanged pleasantries with fellow members of the congregation. She trusted her husband, as most wives do. She had no idea that her life, their life, was about to change forever. Pastor Anderson glanced nervously at her, but his eyes quickly moved back to the podium as he began his sermon. He knew that what was happening in the background was bigger than anything he could say from the pulpit. In the back row, just before the service began, sat Alicia. Alicia's face was hard, set in an expression that was both determined and furious. She had come to church that morning not for salvation, not to worship, but to confront the man who had kept her in the shadows for years. For far too long, she had been silenced, ignored. But no more. She had one thing in mind: revenge. She had sent messages, demanded more money, but Pastor Anderson had refused. He thought he could ignore her, thinking that if he stopped the payments, she would eventually go away. But he was wrong. Alicia had been pushed to the edge. The anger that had been building inside her finally boiled over. She wasn't going to let him get away with it, not without facing the consequences of his lies. As Pastor Anderson stepped onto the altar, the congregation quieted in anticipation. His voice rang out, strong and steady as he began his sermon. But something was different today. The usual warmth in his voice felt forced, and his eyes kept darting back to Alicia in the back row. Alicia wasn't there to listen to his words. She was there to make sure he would never forget the price of his betrayal. In the hushed silence of the church, Alicia stood up. Her movements were calm, almost too calm. The eyes of the congregation turned to her, confused. She walked slowly down the aisle, her gaze fixed on Pastor Anderson, her steps measured and deliberate. The tension in the room grew with every step she took. Sharon noticed Alicia now, her face frozen in confusion, her heart racing, unsure of what was happening. As Alicia reached the front, she stopped. The entire congregation held its breath. In that moment, it was clear that something was about to happen, but no one could have guessed what would unfold. Pastor Anderson's face went pale. He had no time to react before the gunshot rang out, loud and clear, cutting through the sacred silence of the church. A shot that would forever change everything. The congregation gasped in unison as the pastor collapsed, his body hitting the altar. Sharon screamed. Her hands covered her mouth in disbelief. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted, lay before her, blood seeping across the floor. The woman who had stood in the back, hidden for so long, had just shattered their lives in the most public and brutal way possible. Alicia didn't wait for anyone to stop her. She turned and walked out of the church, leaving a stunned congregation in her wake. And as the chaos unfolded, the question remained: what had pushed Alicia to this point? What did she want from Pastor Anderson, and how far was she willing to go to get it? The service had been progressing as it always did, with the congregation listening intently to Pastor Anderson's sermon. But suddenly, there was a shift in the air. Alicia, sitting quietly at the back of the church, stood up. Her eyes locked onto Pastor Anderson, unwavering, and in that moment the room seemed to hold its breath. The gentle hum of the service came to an abrupt halt. The rustling of hymnals, the quiet whispers between congregants, everything stopped. All eyes were now on Alicia, who moved with a purpose. Her expression was cold, a mixture of rage and something more dangerous: determination. This wasn't about money anymore. It wasn't about a simple dispute over an allowance. This was personal. Alicia began walking down the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The congregation, stunned, exchanged confused glances. Was this a public display of anger? Or was it something far worse? Sharon, sitting in the front row, looked up in surprise. She had no idea what was happening, her heart racing as she watched Alicia approach. With every step Alicia took, the tension in the church seemed to mount, a heavy pressure that no one could escape. The pastor's face, once full of the usual calm composure, turned pale as Alicia drew nearer. He could feel the shift, the energy in the room changing, but it was too late. He was already too deep into this web of lies to back away. Then, in a single, heart-stopping moment, Alicia stopped. She was just a few feet away from the altar. The air was thick with anticipation. Without a word, she reached into her bag. Time seemed to slow. Then, the shot rang out. The deafening sound of the gunshot shattered the silence, as loud as thunder, echoing through the walls of the church. It was the only sound that mattered now. Pastor Anderson staggered back, his body crumpling as the bullet found its mark. He collapsed onto the altar, blood spilling across the floor in a sickening spread. Sharon's scream pierced the air, sharp and full of horror. She shot to her feet, her hands pressed against her face in disbelief. Her world shattered in that instant. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was her reality, crashing down before her eyes. The man she loved, the man she had built her life around, was now lying in a pool of blood, taken from her in the most shocking and public way possible. The congregation, frozen in shock, couldn't comprehend what had just happened. Whispers and cries of panic began to spread, but the room felt like it was trapped in a thick fog of confusion. People rushed to the altar, trying to help, trying to stop the bleeding, but it was too late. Alicia had already made her move. The smell of gunpowder lingered in the air, sharp and acrid. It mixed with the scent of sweat and fear that now filled the room. The church, once a place of peace and comfort, had turned into a scene of chaos and tragedy. The sound of frantic footsteps, the clamor of people shouting for help, it was as if the entire world had gone into a tailspin. But Alicia was already gone. She didn't wait around to see the aftermath. As quickly as she had entered, she had left, vanishing into the streets, leaving the congregation to deal with the devastation she had caused. Just like that, the quiet Sunday morning, so full of promise, had turned into an unforgettable nightmare. Now the question loomed, why? What had driven Alicia to this point? And what would happen next? As the investigation began, it would uncover far more than anyone could have ever imagined. The moment the police arrived at the scene, the atmosphere was thick with confusion. The church, once a place of peace, was now the center of a crime that no one had seen coming. Detectives moved quickly, securing the area, trying to piece together what had just unfolded. The first question on everyone's mind was the same: why did Alicia do this? What could have driven her to shoot the pastor in front of his wife and the entire congregation? And why in such a public and violent way? Sharon, still in shock, was escorted from the church. Her face, pale and streaked with tears, said everything. The pain of seeing her husband lying in a pool of blood had left her speechless. But the police had no time for sympathy. They needed answers. As they began questioning witnesses, the details started to piece together. The story that emerged was one of financial strain and mounting tension. Alicia had been demanding more money from Pastor Anderson for months. The pastor had been sending her a monthly allowance to support their daughter, but recently, he had decided to cut her off. He felt the time had come to end the arrangement, to stop paying her, and hoped she would let go of the past. But Alicia wasn't ready to let go. Witnesses confirmed that Alicia had been making threats, veiled promises of exposing the pastor's secret to his wife, his congregation, and the world if he didn't comply with her request. The tension between them was clear to those who knew them. But as the investigation continued, it became clear this wasn't just about money. It was personal. Alicia didn't just want financial support, she wanted control. She wanted to make Pastor Anderson pay for keeping her and their child in the shadows, for hiding their existence. The more detectives dug into Alicia's history with the pastor, the more unsettling the picture became. Then, investigators uncovered a series of threatening messages between Alicia and Pastor Anderson. They were messages full of rage, threats, and demands. But there was one message that stood out above all the others, one that had been sent just days before the shooting. The words seemed innocent at first, but upon further inspection, they were far more chilling than they appeared. In the message, Alicia wrote, "You don't want to see what happens if you keep pushing me away. I'll make sure you never forget what you've done." To anyone else, this might have seemed like an empty threat. But to the investigators, this was a red flag. Alicia's anger wasn't just about money, it was about something deeper, something much more dangerous. The police immediately turned their attention to a potential motive that had remained hidden for too long. Could this be a crime of passion? Or was there something more at play? Had Alicia been plotting for months, carefully waiting for the right moment to strike? The answer wasn't clear, but one thing was, Alicia had planned this attack. The detectives dug deeper into Alicia's past. What they uncovered sent shockwaves through the investigation. Alicia had a history of instability, short temper, violent outbursts, and a pattern of using manipulation to get what she wanted. She had been obsessed with the idea of ruining Pastor Anderson's life, and now it seemed she had taken that obsession to its tragic conclusion. But there was one final piece of evidence that turned the investigation on its head. As police reviewed security footage from the church, they noticed something strange. Alicia had arrived at the church much earlier than anyone had anticipated. She had been waiting in the shadows, preparing for the moment when the pastor would step onto the altar. This wasn't an impulsive act of rage, it was calculated. What was her true intent? Was this just about revenge for being ignored? Or was there something more dangerous lurking beneath the surface of her anger? The investigation had just begun, but one thing was clear: Alicia wasn't just a woman scorned. She was a woman who had been pushed to the brink, and she had been planning this for far longer than anyone realized. Alicia was arrested the same day as the shooting, but what came next shocked everyone. As the news spread, the media descended, eager to hear what had driven Alicia to such an extreme act. In a series of press interviews, Alicia spoke for the first time, revealing what she believed had led her to pull the trigger. She claimed that years of manipulation and control from Pastor Anderson had pushed her to the edge. She painted a picture of a woman trapped, unable to escape the cycle of emotional and financial demands. But as the public listened, the question remained: was this a woman acting in self-defense, or was it cold-blooded revenge? Alicia's defense focused on her claim that she had been cornered, that the pastor had promised to cut her off, and that her emotional and financial dependence had left her desperate. Was this a woman who had reached her breaking point, or was it a carefully planned execution of her frustration and anger? Sharon, Pastor Anderson's wife, was forced to confront the painful reality of the situation. As the trial began, she sat in the courtroom, her heart torn in two. How could she reconcile the man she had spent years loving with the shocking betrayal that had unfolded in front of her? The woman she had called a friend, who had been in her life for so long, had now become the person responsible for destroying it all. During Sharon's testimony, her pain was clear. Her words trembled as she spoke of the life she had built with her husband and how the betrayal had shattered it. "I never knew about the monthly allowance," she sobbed. "I never knew what he was hiding. How could he do this to me? How could he keep this secret from me for so long?" Sharon's grief was raw and real. She was left to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the dark secret that had been kept from her for years. Her heartache was compounded by the humiliation of having her trust violated in the most public way imaginable. As the trial continued, it became clear that the case wasn't just about a shooting. It was about broken trust, the lengths people would go to when they feel betrayed, and the destructive power of hidden secrets. The prosecution painted Alicia as a woman consumed by jealousy and greed, who had taken the law into her own hands to force Pastor Anderson into submission. Alicia's demands for more money, her threats to expose the pastor's secret, and her cold approach to the violence were all highlighted as evidence that this wasn't a crime of self-defense, it was an act of revenge. The defense, however, argued that Alicia's actions were the result of years of emotional abuse and neglect. They claimed that she had been driven to the edge by the pastor's broken promises and the financial pressures he had placed on her. She had been left with no other choice, they argued. The jury deliberated for hours, each member weighing the evidence, considering the testimony, and trying to determine whether Alicia had acted out of self-preservation or if she had planned the crime from the very beginning. When the verdict was finally delivered, the room held its breath. Alicia was found guilty of attempted murder and assault. The jury had reached a decision, and in the end, the sentence was clear. Alicia was sentenced to 15 years in prison for her actions. The emotional fallout was palpable. While the court had delivered its verdict, no one could escape the complexity of what had occurred. Sharon sat in the courtroom, her emotions a mixture of relief and sorrow. She had wanted justice, but what did justice really look like in this case? Was 15 years enough to make up for the years of betrayal, the public humiliation, and the trauma she had experienced? And what would happen to Alicia, the woman who had once been a part of her life, the woman whose actions had destroyed everything? The shockwaves from that fateful Sunday morning reverberated through the local Chicago community long after the shooting. The church, once a place of refuge and trust, would never be the same. How could anyone look at their pastor the same way again after witnessing such a brutal, public act of violence? The betrayal felt by the congregation was deep. The man they had revered, the one they had turned to for spiritual guidance, had a secret that, once exposed, shattered the image of a leader they thought they knew. For the members of the church, the questions lingered. How had they missed the signs? Could they have done something to prevent it? Pastor Anderson's public persona as a man of faith was now forever tainted, and the once vibrant church had lost its sense of security. But it wasn't just the congregation that had been impacted. Sharon, the woman who had stood beside her husband for years, was now left to pick up the pieces of a life that no longer resembled the one she had envisioned. How could she rebuild, knowing that her husband had kept such a dangerous secret? How could she trust him again? Sharon's life, too, had been forever changed. She was no longer just a wife, she was a public figure caught in the fallout of a tragedy that no one had seen coming. Pastor Anderson, though physically alive, would never fully recover from the ordeal. His body had been wounded, but it was the scars on the inside that were most painful. His emotional recovery seemed impossible. The shooting had stolen more than his health, it had stolen his peace. The man who had once stood with unwavering confidence behind the pulpit now struggled to face the people who once looked to him for guidance. His career in ministry, once so promising, was tarnished beyond repair. And Alicia? Now behind bars, she was left to face the consequences of a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The anger and rage that had driven her to pull the trigger had given way to the cold reality of prison. Behind bars, Alicia was no longer the woman who had stormed into a church with vengeance in her heart. She was just another inmate, dealing with the aftermath of her actions, trapped by the very choices she had made. The fallout from the shooting wasn't just personal, it was collective. It affected families, friendships, and a community that would never be the same. No one walked away untouched. Pastor Anderson, Sharon, Alicia, and everyone in that congregation were left to grapple with the wreckage of a violent act that had begun with financial betrayal and exploded into a tragedy that no one could have predicted. The ripple effects would continue long after the court's verdict had been delivered. It was a reminder that the darkest secrets can sometimes lead to the most devastating consequences. Do you think Alicia's actions were justified, given the years of financial manipulation and betrayal? Or was this nothing more than a cold, calculated act of revenge? Where should the line be drawn between justice and anger? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your opinions. This one is bound to stir up strong feelings. If you want to learn more about shocking true crime stories like this, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss what we have coming next. And remember, if you believe that no one should be left to suffer from betrayal, that loyalty should always be honored, subscribe to the channel and stand with us as we continue exploring these real stories of justice and consequences.